So it's an absolute privilege to be able to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Hiva Fassihi. She is the head of the Photodermatology Unit and the National XP Service at St. John's Institute of Dermatology, involved in a lot of translational research and has really helped to improve our understanding of photodermatoses. So thank you so much, Hiva.
Right, I'm very aware we're running late and you're all probably hungry, but I'll try and make this interesting. So I've got this very broad title of Evolving Landscape of Photoprotection. So I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about solar radiation and its impact on the skin, because you need to understand this to then talk about photoprotection. This is sunlight, solar radiation, and as you can see, it's made up of ultraviolet, visible, and infrared. And as you go from one to the other side, you can see the wavelength gets longer. Generally, the shorter the wavelength, the more damaging the radiation, and that's more likely to do harm to humans. And ultraviolet is divided into ultraviolet C, B, and A, mainly based on its biological effect on the skin. Now, ultraviolet C, with that shortest wavelength, and which was most damaging, is actually absorbed by the ozone, and 95% of ultraviolet B is absorbed. And most of what reaches us on the Earth's surface is ultraviolet A, and only 5% is ultraviolet B. But that 5% is 1,000 times more damaging than ultraviolet A because of that short wavelength. And when you look at ultraviolet radiation and how it penetrates the skin, UVC doesn't get to us on the Earth, but if it did, and if you remember during COVID, they were trying to use UVC as a way of sort of killing viruses, it doesn't penetrate much deeper than the stratum corneum, so it's not particularly harmful, but it doesn't really reach us from the sun. Ultraviolet B at the most gets up to the papillary dermis, and ultraviolet A can penetrate deeper, sometimes right down to the subcutis. And if you look at the amount of the solar terrestrial radiation, so what actually reaches us on the Earth's surface, you can see that it's only 7% is ultraviolet, about 39% is visible light. This allows us to see, and it's important for photosynthesis, and 54% is infrared. This is what we feel as warmth on our skin. And here you can see ultraviolet, which is a very small proportion, is essentially divided into ultraviolet B and 2 bits of ultraviolet A, the shorter wavelength ultraviolet A2 and the slightly longer wavelength ultraviolet A1. So it took me ages to put these slides together, but I hope it's helpful. There's been a lot of chat about ultraviolet A and visible light and how damaging it is on our skin. But I want to take you back to the basics. The basics are that ultraviolet B is the most damaging, and it does most of the trouble on our skin. So if you look at sunburn, so sunburn is predominantly caused by ultraviolet B. It can be caused a little bit by ultraviolet A2, and if you sort of look at how much more ultraviolet A you need than ultraviolet B, it's sort of the equivalent of about, put my glasses on, sorry. So it's about 1,000 times more of ultraviolet A that you need to cause the same degree of sunburn as ultraviolet B. So essentially, when you see sunburn, the majority of it's caused by ultraviolet B. So let's look at photocarcinogenesis. So we all know that ultraviolet B is the most damaging. It damages DNA, but there has been data in the last 10 years or so that ultraviolet A also damages DNA in a different way and can cause photocarcinogenesis. And we've touched on some of this through Lucy's talk, but essentially this is data from the BAD. So the reason we need to be aware of photoprotection is these. So you can see that over the last 10 years, the number of new melanoma diagnoses have gone up from 12,000 to 18,000. The number of non-melanoma diagnoses have gone from 170,000 to well over 200,000, and that's in England. The deaths have gone up as well, so deaths from melanoma have gone up to 2,000 in 2020, and from non-melanoma up to 800. And the prediction is that over the next 20 years, the number of skin cancers are going to grow by 34%, so this is where the AI becomes very important. And this burden of skin cancer, if you look at that compared to other cancers, essentially skin cancers grouped together, all of them together, are the sort of top cancer in England, well above prostate and breast. And then if you divide it up, you can see the top line there is BCCs, so that's the most common of all cancers reported. You can see SCCs is the third most common, and melanoma is down there as the 9th most common. So the large majority of these cancers are caused by ultraviolet radiation, and improving photoprotection is another way of dealing with this massive skin cancer burden that we have. And as part of this, there's been an all-party parliamentary group set up where they're going to look at how we can improve photoprotection in the UK, much like they did in Australia, or have been doing in Australia. And I was invited to give evidence on this, this group, and hopefully the outcome will be very helpful. So let's go back to photocarcinogenesis. UVB, how does UVB cause skin cancers? UVB causes direct DNA damage. It comes in, hits the DNA in your keratinocytes, causes these pyrimidine dimers, and causes the classic UV signature mutations, the CT to CC or TT mutations. And if they're not corrected or repaired, they go on to form activation of oncogenes, and they silence tumor suppressor genes, and all of that will then result in cell cycle dysregulation and carcinogenesis. That's UVB. I did also say to you, UVA can also cause damage. It does it in an indirect way. So UVA causes indirect damage to DNA through the formation of these reactive oxygen species, and that indirect damage, if it's not corrected, will also go on to result in carcinogenesis. But UV does one other thing that is implicated in photocarcinogenesis. It causes immunosuppression. This is why we use UV for treatment of narrowband UVB for psoriasis and eczema. So those three reasons are why UV causes photocarcinogenesis. And here, if you are really looking at it, there's more immunosuppression caused by UVB, and it happens more quickly than with UVA, but UVA can also cause immunosuppression. So photoaging, wasn't sure how to do my box here, because I think it's about the same for UVB and UVA. And we'll discuss that a little bit further. So photoaging is different to normal chronological aging. You can see these deep coarse wrinkles, leathery appearance, pigmentation, laxity, telangiectasia. And if you looked at this, how is ultraviolet causing photoaging? Well, ultraviolet B and A are both involved. Ultraviolet B induces these transcription factors, shown here, which then go on to induce the expression of something called MMP, matrix metalloproteinases, which break down collagen and elastin. UVA also does this, but it does it through the formation of reactive oxygen species. That also then induces these MMPs, and that also breaks down collagen and elastin. And it also causes DNA damage in the mitochondria, which forms more reactive oxygen species, and that's sort of a vicious cycle. So both UVB and UVA cause photoaging. Now, there's some confusion about pigmentation on the skin, but there's two types of pigmentation you can get on the skin. You can get this immediate tanning. And this is divided into two bits. It's the immediate pigment darkening, or the persistent pigment darkening. And we'll come to persistent pigment darkening because that's how we measure how well your sunscreen protects against UVA. So this is all caused by UVA. You can see on my graph there's no UVB involvement. And this is because UVA, with that longer wavelength, goes in, oxidizes the melanin, and that causes that sort of initial color you get. It's sometimes a bit sort of gray looking. But that all resolves within 24 hours. And then what you're really interested in is what actually causes melanogenesis, and that's mostly UVB. So despite all your lectures on long wavelength UVA and visible light, yes, they do cause pigmentation, but UVB is the main cause of melanogenesis. But as this is quite trendy at the moment, there have been a few studies to show how visible light causes hyperpigmentation, and they've done studies to show long wavelength UVA causes pigmentation, visible light causes pigmentation, but more commonly on darker skin tones. And the two together, shown in this diagram here where it shows the total, actually cause even more pigmentation. So if you've got someone of darker skin tones, they do need to be careful with visible light and long wavelength UVA, because that can enhance the pigmentation that's caused. And being a photodermatologist, I can't not mention photodermatoses. So although you refer patients to us and we do all these photo testing, the main reason we do it is because we need to know which bit of that electromagnetic spectrum is triggering their photodermatosis. So because you're all falling asleep, top right is polymorphic light eruption. Do you know what triggers polymorphic light eruption predominantly? So predominantly UVA. That one is hydrovacciniforme. Do you know what predominantly triggers hydrovacciniforme? also UVA. This chap has got chronic actinic dermatitis, so it's usually UVB, UVA can also be visible, but UVB tends to be the main trigger. I love this picture of solar urticaria. He's a rugby player who had a white number on his back, and the ESU's actually gone through, which suggests to you it's a longer wavelength going through his clothing. So it can be UVA visible, but people can have UVB solar urticaria as well. And I couldn't find a picture of EPP, but all the porphyrias are caused by visible light. So if you go and tell your porphyria patients to smother themselves in sun cream, it won't do much unless it's got visible light protection in it as well. And don't forget vitamin D. And vitamin D is actually induced by or synthesized by UVB in the skin. And there's an optimal wavelength of 295 for it. So those are the main effects of solar radiation on the skin. But of course, we know that UV actually varies depending on where you are in the world, what the environmental factors are. So all the things like time of day, the season, the latitude, the cloud cover, all of these things do matter. But I often show my patients this graph. So the darker orange is UVB, and you can see it's quite low at the start of the day. It peaks in the middle of the day and goes down. But UVA is consistently quite high during the day. It goes up a little bit more and then stays high. So if you're trying to protect against UVA, this, missing the 11 to 2 in the middle of the day is not enough. They need to protect throughout the day. So that goes for the photodermatoses, it goes for pigmentation, it goes for other things. And then, of course, the UV index that a lot of patients rely on. This was actually developed in 1992. Actually started after the depletion of the ozone, and everyone was panicking about how we were all going to be affected by UV. But I think it's quite a helpful measure of how easily people may sunburn. So anything above a level of UV3, you should be photoprotecting. And of course, in the UK, we never quite get to levels of 11 or 12. That's sort of more, Mediterranean weather. So let's go on to photoprotection. Why does it matter, and how do we personalize it? So it matters because we want to avoid cancer, we want to avoid sunburn, we want to avoid photoaging, we want to avoid pigmentation, and if you've got photosensitivity disorders, we want to avoid those as well. And I always put this slide up because it's not just about sun cream, it's actually about your behavior, so sun protecting, staying indoors, covering up with clothing. I often say to patients about these companies like Coolibar and Solbari that produce UV protective clothing ranges. And then, of course, there's sunscreens as well. And for those who are really sensitive, don't forget that although UVB is blocked by windows, UVA with that longer wavelength will penetrate. And so if you've got someone, say, with chronic actinic dermatitis who's also reacting to UVA, they may benefit from these protective window films that are completely clear from companies like Dermagard. And I think now we're talking more about personalized photoprotection. We're all different. We all have different skin colors. We all have different underlying skin conditions. So it has to be adapted to your skin color, to the patient's age, to the environment that you're in, to your lifestyle, how much time do you spend outside, and to any underlying skin conditions. And we know that patients with fairer skin are more prone to sunburn, more prone to skin cancer, more prone to photoaging. But we know that patients who have got melanin in their skin or higher levels of melanin in their skin, so if you've got skin phototype 5 or 6, that gives you a natural SPF of about 8. So that's your sun cream already on your skin. But patients with darker skin tones are more prone to pigmentary disorders. So you need to personalize what you're trying to target in your patient. And here you can see that maybe you're protecting with darker skin tones for pigmentation, but not necessarily for skin cancer or for sunburn. And this was a nice publication, which again just highlights that the lighter skin tones are more prone to skin cancer, and that's more UVB. And then the darker skin types may be more prone to pigmentation, so that's UVB and UVA. So you will target your patient depending on what their problems are. Now, for those of you who don't know, we can now prescribe sunscreens on the NHS. On the British Photodermatology Group, there's a list of conditions that you can prescribe sunscreen for. And at the moment, the main sunscreen we're prescribing is the Anthelios. It's actually just the 250 ml SPF 50. But anyone with these conditions can have sunscreen prescribed. And a great news from the 5th of September, was that the WHO actually declared sunscreens as an essential medicine. It used to be cosmetics before that, and now for patients with ocular cutaneous albinism and other conditions like XP, they can have access to sunscreens where they didn't before. So this is great news. So how have sunscreens evolved? We started back in the 1930s with sunscreens when they first were launched. And initially, there were just UVB filters that were in the sunscreens. Nobody really knew much about UVA. And people started understanding more about UVB and skin cancers, so they were advocated for use in prevention of skin cancers. And the FDA recommended that sunscreen should have an SPF of 15. That was back in 1978. And the highest in the 1980s was an SPF 15. I remember going to the beach and having sun cream with an SPF 2. I mean, I don't think that exists anymore. And then from the 80s, the mid-80s, we started getting some good UVA filters as well. And now the guidelines are that actually any sunscreen that you buy should cover up to 370. Bear in mind, visible light starts at 400 nanometers. All sunscreens have to cover until 370. So that's most of the UVA, but not the long wavelength UVA. So I'm not a chemist. I don't design sunscreens, but I know they're very complicated. We had an excellent lecture a few years ago from the Anthelios chemists from La Roche-Posay who were telling us all about these other ingredients. What I just wanted to highlight is that sunscreens have a really high percentage of the UV filters compared to everything else in them. And that's because their role is to protect us from the sun. And if you look, we have a lot of filters out there. This was just something I took from the internet. There's actually a lot of very good UVB filters. There are some UVA filters, and there aren't that many UVA1 and visible light filters, but we'll come on to discuss this in a minute. So these are the organic or chemical filters. The physical sunscreens, or the inorganic filters, there's really only two. There is titanium dioxide and zinc oxide. And in their true form, they're very white. It's a bit like what the cricketers wear, when they're playing cricket over their nose. They're very white, and because they're white, they reflect visible light. They're chemically inert, so they're quite safe for children's sunscreens. And because they really do cover the visible light spectrum, they're quite good for the inflammatory pigmentation or melasma. But now we're trying to nanosize them, so making these big particles that reflect a lot of light into small, cosmetically acceptable particles, and that makes them much nicer to rub in and use cosmetically. But it does cause problems, and I'll come back to that. So sunscreens, chemical sunscreens absorb, and then this is what was in the books. The physical sunscreens reflect ultraviolet and visible. But actually, that's not true. So there was this lovely publication that showed very, very clearly that these sunscreens, these physical sunscreens like zinc oxide, they actually absorb right up to, you can see there, about 400 nanometers. So they're actually absorbing ultraviolet, but they do reflect after 400. So they reflect the visible light, but they absorb the ultraviolet. So it's incorrect to say that they reflect everything. They absorb ultraviolet but reflect visible light. So now we say that both chemical and physical sunscreens, they both absorb ultraviolet, not reflect, but the physical ones can also reflect visible light if they are white on the skin, because that's why you know that they are reflecting. But this is what happens when you nanosize them. So all the companies nanosize their physical sunscreens because they are cosmetically nicer. But when you nanosize it, this is a normal size physical block. You can see it covers right the way through from the ultraviolet into the visible. You can see the line. As soon as you nanosize them, their properties change. They stop protecting in the visible range, and they become really good UVB protectors, I suppose absorbers of UVB. So if you've got a lot of nano-sized physical blocks in your sunscreen, they're not protecting against visible light, they're just doing UVB protection. So that's important to note as well. So unless it's white on the skin, it's not protecting you from visible light. So what do we do instead? We looked for tinted sunscreens. So iron oxide added to your sunscreen is very, very good at also reflecting. And it can be tricky because you've got to find the right color. It can stain clothes. Gentlemen certainly don't like wearing sunscreens with color in them, but they are very, very good for those pigmentary disorders like melasma and hyperpigmentation. So sunscreen regulations, we're very lucky in the UK, is all I'll say. In Europe, sunscreens are cosmetics. In the US, they're actually over-the-counter drugs. And that means they have to go through quite a lot of regulations through the FDA before they can be changed. So in the UK, we've authorized lots of filters and our sunscreens are always improving, whereas in the US, they really struggle with updating their sunscreens because of the regulations. And actually the FDA often rejects new filters that come out. So I guess just to make the point that in the UK, our sunscreens are probably better than the ones you buy in the US. So this you all know. How do you measure how effective your sunscreen is? The SPF, and this is a little bugbear of mine, the SPF is not your UVB protection, it's your sunburn protection. And you now know that sunburn can be caused by UVB and UVA. But your UVA protection is not so standardized, and they use this persistent pigment darkening that we were talking about, which is very quick, comes on and goes away within 24 hours. So your SPF essentially is the dose to cause sunburn with sunscreen over the dose to cause sunburn without sunscreen. So if you normally burn in 10 minutes and you've got an SPF 15 on, then it takes 15 times as long. So it takes 150 minutes to develop that sunburn. But that is only if you wear your sunscreen, as recommended, 2 milligrams per centimeter squared, which nobody does, by the way. But if you did it correctly, that's what your SPF would protect you. With UVA, there's no sort of standardized method. We have the star rating in boots, which is a sort of proportion of UVB to UVA protection. The rating I like is the PPD because it actually tells you about UVA protection. So this is exactly the same as testing for sunburn and SPF, but you're looking for pigment now rather than sunburn. And most European sunscreens have this UVA seal of approval, a UVA with a circle in it, which tells you that you have pretty good coverage in the UVA range for the proportion of UVB protection. And how should you apply your sunscreen? You all know this. You should put it on way before you go out. It's no good chucking it on just before you go out the front door. A good 15 to 20 minutes so that it has time to sort of sit on the skin and absorb in. Reapply every couple of hours if you're being active. And if you carry a shot glass around with you, you need a shot glass to cover your entire body, maybe on holiday, right? But I always put this, that it's not just the sun cream. You've got to do all those other things. You've got to seek shade, wear protective clothing, wear hats, sunglasses, etc. Patients often ask me about once daily sunscreens. You know, I've got the once daily, I don't need to reapply, it's often what you get. And I say, yes, your once daily sunscreen is very good. The filters are really photostable. They are very good for over 8 hours. And even if you test them in the laboratory, you only lose about 20% even after sort of moderate exercise and sort of toweling. But the problem is we're human. This is an example of somebody putting their sun cream on, and this is the first application. You can see all the bits that she's missed on her legs. So those bits would all burn. My colleague, Bob Sarkany, actually examined a PhD thesis, and this was pictures from that thesis. And he said to the PhD student, so what's the conclusion from your massive PhD? And she just said, apply twice. So she said, apply once, wait a bit, and then just apply it again. And then that way you won't miss all these bits. So how do we apply sunscreens in real life? I did sort of suggest that we don't apply at 2 milligrams per centimeter squared. We do not. They've done all these studies, and because of time, I'll just whiz through them very quickly. But you can see that in all these studies, nobody was able to apply it 2 milligrams per centimeter squared. These are great studies, nudist beach, measuring the sunscreens. The best people could do, volunteers brought into the laboratory and got to put on as much as they possibly could. They were applying 1 milligram per centimeter squared. So nobody can do 2 milligrams per centimeter squared. So the question has to be asked, why did the laboratories test with that? And what happens then? So if you apply 2 milligrams per centimeter squared and you've got an SPF 50, well, you can stay out there 50 times as long as it normally takes you to burn. If you only apply half that, unfortunately, it drops down exponentially, not linearly. So you get down to about an SPF 7. And if most of us do what my husband does, which is put it on and sort of rub it off his skin, then you're sort of down to about an SPF 2. Which is not bad, because if you burn in half an hour, you can stay out there for an hour before you burn. But I guess the takeaway message is when you put your sun cream on, put it on generously, put it on so it's a layer on the skin, and just wait for it to absorb in. And then there's always bits that people miss, and they've done studies to show this, and most people miss their ears, tops of ears, and tops of feet. So again, if you're putting your sun cream on, particularly the gentlemen, don't forget your ears. And then, of course, there's this whole story of sun creams are really good, but they actually encourage intentional sun exposure behavior. So there are parts of the world where we're all like this, and there's part of the world where nobody wants to get a tan. But in areas where people like to get a tan, the desire to get, so this intentional sun exposure is the desire to acquire a tan. And actually, people spend as much time outdoors as possible to get that tan with sun cream on. So actually, wearing sun cream meant most people spend 25% time more outside than they would have. And usually people who wear sun cream are outdoors in the middle of the day trying not to burn and get a tan. So there is this other element to sunscreens that's not particularly helpful. And this is a great study. I wish I'd been invited to do these studies. You go on holiday with 25 Danish holiday makers, and they were given sun cream, and all of them got burnt. So that just tells you about sunscreen on its own. I'm not going to be too much longer, just a couple of things about new things that are coming out in sunscreens. So there's a lot of progress happening. There's new filters being discovered all the time. So these ones going more into the long wavelength UVA and into the visible. There's environmental challenges. So there's suggestions that maybe the coral is being bleached by all the sunscreen that the beach goers supply. And the jury's kind of out. The reason for this is that the amount of sunscreen that's found in the waters around beaches is in nanograms per litre, and most of the toxicology data is in milligrams per litre. So the idea is that there's not enough in the waters to cause it, but that's just something to think about. And finally, there is this worry about sunscreens being absorbed by us into our bloodstream, and most of the discussion was about oxybenzone. It's very controversial. There were possible data related to endocrine disruptor, and obviously that's the one that seemed to cause most photocontact allergy as well, and actually it's been taken out of most of the European sunscreens. This was the paper that caused me a lot of problem, even in my patients with XP, who are all getting skin cancer from a very young age. I just wanted to highlight that it was in healthy volunteers, but look at that, 2 milligrams per centimeter squared. So somehow they must have bathed them in sun cream, and that was applied to 75% of the body. So nobody would do this, right? And the avobenzone, there was sort of placebo amounts found in the blood, and the conclusion was that, you know, it didn't really indicate there was a massive problem. But this got out into the newspapers, and people were sort of saying, I'm not going to put my sun cream on, it's very dangerous. But I think overall the evidence still stands that protecting your skin from skin cancers using sun cream is more important than the potential toxic effects of sunscreens. So there are 3 new sort of sunscreen ingredients that are very good at covering the visible and long wavelength UVA. One is the Mexaryl 400, which just happens to be in the UV Mune Anthelios. And then there's this Triazorb and this other ingredient that I'm not going to try and pronounce, but all of these you can see are protecting now into the long wavelength UVA and into the visible. So these are new filters coming out, which is great. To keep sunscreens as safe as possible, you want to keep your UV filters effective, but in low concentrations. There are new ways of now encapsulating the ingredients so that stops the potential absorption into the skin. Sometimes mixing UV filters with antioxidants actually enable photostability of the filters, minimize their degradation, and also reduce the oxidative stress, so that's a helpful thing to do as well. People are looking into oral antioxidants as well, which again can help particularly with pigmentation. And there's a lot of studies going on into these natural photoprotectants from things under the sea. And actually these would be very safe because they're sort of natural products. So I suspect in the next few years we're going to have some natural sunscreen filters as well. I had to put this in because a lot of people are on social media, and the lovely Professor Anthony Young, who some of you know, he's a retired photobiologist, the only scientist who works in photobiology in the UK, wrote this for the BJD because there were a few little bugbears that he had. So I thought I'd just highlight 3 of the points he made in this paper. One is what we discussed before, that the SPF is a measure of your UVB protection. So I think we've just clarified that. SPF is a measure of your sunburn protection, not just your UVB, because UVA can burn you as well, just at much higher doses. Everyone says UVA because it's got that longer wavelength that goes in the skin. That's the main cause of photoaging, but he made the point that in the majority of the studies, actually UVB causes more photoaging than UVA does. But UVA does too, so that's your second point to take away. And then there's this whole hoo-ha about sunscreens and vitamin D synthesis. In fact, it's the reason why a lot of patients don't wear sun cream, because they think vitamin D is very important and they don't want to stop their vitamin D production. Yes, here it just shows that even in suberythema doses, so even in small doses on your arms, on your legs, most of the studies show that you do produce enough vitamin D, so you don't have to worry about wearing your sun cream, probably because we don't wear it properly anyway. And this was this looked at all the studies about the effects of sunscreens on vitamin D, and essentially the bottom line was there's very little evidence that sunscreen use decreases your levels of vitamin D in real life settings. So don't worry, you can wear your sun cream and your vitamin D will be fine. So in summary, we've covered all these things, but I'm sure you're ready for lunch, so I won't do that. Essentially, the technology is changing. We've got new filters, new formulations, and maybe we're getting better at sort of covering the entire UV and visible light range. I still go back to the point that sunscreens alone aren't enough. You need to do all your behavioral things as well. And essentially, I think we're going to go forward and have very personalized sun protection and sunscreens, depending on what the individual's problems are. And these two papers, if you want to read them, I thought would be interesting. One is about personalized photoprotection, and the other is actually from Australia, and it's a position statement. And they are starting to stratify their sun protection advice based on Fitzpatrick skin phototypes and skin cancer risks in patients. And in there, they say that the emphasis is on skin cancer prevention, and they're not advocating that skin phototypes 5 and 6 wear sunscreen routinely if they don't have any other skin issues. So I thought that was an interesting one to go and read. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a brilliant guide of everything we need to know about sunscreen. It's so helpful.